The alarm on Kestrel Station screamed before Vren even opened his eyes. He rolled off his sleeping frame, grabbed the nearest support rail, and pulled himself toward the command deck as the floor lights switched from soft blue to a hard, pulsing red. Something had come through the outer relay, and it was not one of theirs. Vren had served the Kalith Stellar Alliance for over 40 cycles, long enough to know the difference between a drill and a real breach. This was real. He could feel it in the way the station groaned around him, in the way officers stopped mid-sentence and simply ran. When he reached the command deck, the main screen showed a single ship sitting motionless, just past the outer boundary. It was not a Drevoth vessel. Its hull was unfamiliar, blocky, almost careless in its design, as if whoever built it cared more about function than elegance. A small light blinked steadily near its nose, a signal, not a weapon lock. "Identify!" barked Commander Solari, the station's ranking officer, a tall Kalith with pale gray skin and eyes that missed nothing. The comms officer, a nervous young Talvex named Ren, worked his console with shaking hands. "Ma'am, it is responding to our hailing frequency. It says they are human." The room went quiet. Vren had heard the word before, buried in old briefing files nobody bothered to read anymore. Humans were a species from a small, unremarkable system on the far edge of Alliance space. They had been observed quietly for decades, mostly because the Alliance Council could not decide whether they were worth the effort of contact. Reports described them as short-lived, disorganized, and prone to conflict among themselves. Not a threat, not an asset, just noise on the edge of the map. "Let them dock," Commander Solari said finally, slowly. "Weapons ready, but do not provoke." Vren volunteered to be part of the welcoming party, mostly out of curiosity. He wanted to see, with his own eyes, what kind of creature had crossed so much distance without an invitation. The airlock hissed open, and the first human stepped through. She was smaller than Vren expected, with dark hair pulled back tightly, and eyes that scanned the room once, quickly, before settling on Commander Solari. She wore a simple gray uniform with no visible rank markings, though something about the way she stood told Vren she was in charge. "Captain Elena Reyes," she said, extending a hand that nobody in the room understood what to do with. She lowered it after a moment, unbothered. "Earth Coalition Fleet, we received your distress broadcast 11 days ago." Solari blinked. "Our broadcast was not directed at your system." "No," Reyes agreed. "It wasn't. We picked it up anyway. We've been listening for a while." Vren studied her carefully. There was no fear in her posture, no hesitation, even though she stood alone among species she had never met, on a station under active threat, having crossed a distance that should have taken her people generations to cover. Behind her, 3 more humans entered, each carrying equipment Vren did not recognize, moving with the same quiet, economical confidence. "You are aware," Solari said slowly, "that this sector is at war. We are. You are aware that the enemy we face has ended 40 inhabited systems. We read the reports your listening posts didn't know we were intercepting," Reyes said. "We know what the Drevoth swarm is. We know what it does to worlds it reaches. That's why we're here." Solari exchanged a look with Vren, one that needed no translation. Every species in the Alliance had heard of the swarm's reputation, and had, at some point, considered turning away from the war entirely. No one volunteered for it. No one asked to be sent to the worst fighting. "Why would your people choose this?" Vren asked, unable to stop himself. Reyes turned to him, and for the first time, something flickered behind her calm expression, something that looked almost like grim humor. "Because if we don't stop it here, it eventually reaches us. And because, frankly, this is the kind of fight we understand." Vren did not know what to make of that answer. Over the following hours, as more human ships arrived and docked in careful, disciplined order, he began compiling notes, partly for his official report and partly for himself. He wanted to understand these newcomers before deciding whether to trust them. The human fleet was small compared to Alliance standards, barely a dozen ships against the hundreds the Alliance could field, but every vessel moved with purpose. Every crew member seemed to know exactly where to be and when. There was no wasted motion, no confusion, even among species who had never operated alongside Kalith systems before. Within 6 hours, Human engineers had already mapped Kestrel Station's power grid and quietly proposed 3 efficiency improvements, 2 of which Solari's own engineers had been arguing about for months. Vren found himself walking the lower decks that evening, observing human soldiers as they settled into temporary quarters. He expected complaints. Long journeys tended to produce them, even among disciplined Alliance crews. Instead, he found something closer to routine. Soldiers checked equipment, cleaned weapons they clearly hoped not to use unnecessarily, and spoke to each other in low, easy tones that suggested long familiarity rather than nervous small talk. One young soldier, a broad-shouldered man named Ryan Pierce, noticed Vren watching and offered a small nod. "First time seeing humans up close?" "First time seeing your species at all," Vren admitted. Pierce smiled, though there was something tired behind it, an exhaustion that seemed older than his years. "Get used to it. We tend to show up where things are bad." "Is that a point of pride?" "Not pride," Pierce said, considering the question seriously. "More like habit. Humanity's spent most of its history dealing with things going wrong. We got good at it, even when we didn't want to be." Vren wanted to ask more, but a signal interrupted them, calling all personnel to the briefing hall. Commander Solari had called an emergency session, and Vren suspected he already knew why. Inside the hall, a massive display illuminated the room with a slow-moving red marker, tracking a Drevoth advance fleet 3 systems away, heading directly toward a small Alliance-held moon called Dinar 6. Dinar 6 was not strategically significant on its own, but it guarded the approach to a much larger, heavily populated colony behind it. If Dinar 6 fell, the colony would be next, and the colony held nearly 2 million lives. "The garrison at Dinar 6 has requested reinforcement," Solari said grimly. "We have 3 days before the Drevoth fleet arrives. Our nearest available support ships are 5 days out." A heavy silence settled over the room. Vren had seen this pattern before, the terrible arithmetic of a war stretched too thin, of help arriving too late for those who needed it most. Captain Reyes stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "We can be there in under 2 days." The room turned toward her. "Your ships are not rated for that kind of speed through this sector," Solari said carefully. "The gravitational currents near Dinar are unstable. It's not a route Alliance ships attempt without escort." "We know," Reyes said simply. "We already ran the numbers on the way in. It's not the fastest route. It's the fastest survivable one, for our ships specifically. We built them for exactly this kind of terrain." Vren watched Solari hesitate, torn between military caution and desperate need. Every instinct in him understood the risk of trusting an unfamiliar fleet with an assignment this critical. But he also understood, with growing certainty, that no other option existed. "You would be going in without full Alliance support," Solari warned. "No guarantee of reinforcement if things go poorly." "We didn't come here for guarantees," Reyes said. "We came because a garrison is about to be overrun, and a colony full of people is standing behind it." "That's enough of a reason for us." Something in her voice made the decision for the room. Solari nodded once, sharply. "Then Dinar 6 is yours to reinforce. I am assigning an Alliance liaison to accompany your fleet, to coordinate and report back." Vren felt every eye in the room shift toward him before Solari even finished the sentence. "You have field experience and diplomatic clearance," Solari said. "You will go with them." Vren's pulse quickened, though he kept his expression steady. He had requested field postings before, but always with familiar crews, familiar tactics, familiar risks. This was something else entirely, an unknown quantity of a species he had known for less than a day, heading into one of the worst engagements the war had produced in months. "Understood," he said. 2 hours later, Vren stood in the narrow corridor of a human transport ship, watching Kestrel Station shrink behind the viewport as the fleet pulled away. Around him, human crew members moved through final preparations with the same unnerving calm he had seen since their arrival. No raised voices, no visible fear, just quiet, deliberate motion, like a machine settling into its intended rhythm. Captain Reyes found him standing there and paused beside him, studying the same shrinking view of the station. "You're wondering if this was a mistake," she said, not quite a question. "I am wondering many things," Vren admitted. Your species is unfamiliar to me. Your methods are unfamiliar. And you are asking me to trust both, in the middle of the worst war my people have ever fought." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to trust us yet. Just watch. That's what you're here for, isn't it?" "It is." "Then watch," she said. "You'll understand soon enough." The ship's engines hummed beneath them, building toward the jump that would carry them into the unstable currents near Dinar 6, toward a fight that Alliance ships avoided, and human ships apparently welcomed. Vren found himself gripping the rail beside him, not from fear exactly, but from the strange, unfamiliar sensation of not knowing what to expect next. For the first time in decades of service, he genuinely did not know how the coming days would unfold. And despite everything logic told him to feel, despite every warning buried in old reports about this small, distant species, some quiet part of him was almost eager to find out. Behind them, Kestrel Station disappeared into the dark, and ahead, the war waited, closer now than it had ever felt before. The jump through the unstable currents near Dinar 6 felt nothing like the smooth transitions Vren was used to aboard Alliance vessels. The ship shuddered violently for several seconds, throwing loose equipment across the deck, before settling into an eerie, controlled stillness. Vren gripped the rail so hard his knuckles paled, while around him, the human crew simply braced, rode it out, and returned to their stations as though nothing unusual had happened at all. "That," Vren said, steadying his breathing, "is why Alliance ships avoid this route." "It's rough," Reyes agreed, checking a display without any hint of alarm. "But it cuts 18 hours off the approach. 18 hours the garrison at Dinar 6 doesn't have to spare." Vren said nothing, though privately he began recalculating everything he thought he understood about human tolerance for risk. It was not recklessness, he realized. It was something closer to precision, a willingness to accept danger only when the numbers justified it. The fleet dropped out of transit within sight of Dinar 6 roughly 30 hours later, well ahead of even Reyes's own optimistic estimate. The moon hung before them, pale and cratered, its surface marked by the scattered lights of the Alliance garrison stationed near its northern ridge. Beyond it, faint and growing, the first sensor traces of the approaching Drevoth fleet blinked into view. "They're early," Vren said, reading the numbers with rising concern. Nearly a full day ahead of projections. Reyes studied the same display, her expression unreadable. "Then we don't have time to waste making a good first impression. Get me the garrison commander." Within minutes, a tired, static-laced voice filled the bridge. The garrison commander, a Talvex officer named Doss, sounded like someone who had not slept in days. "This is Dinar 6 Command. Identify yourselves immediately." "Captain Elena Reyes, Earth Coalition Fleet, reinforcing your position on Alliance authorization," Reyes replied. "We have Vren of the Calith Stellar Alliance aboard as liaison. Commander Doss, what's your current status?" A long pause followed, filled with distant shouting, audible even through the static. "Status is bad," Doss admitted finally. "Our outer defense line is holding. Barely. We were told reinforcements were 5 days out." "We're early," Reyes said simply. "Send us your defensive layout. We'll integrate as fast as possible." "You'll integrate faster than that," Doss snapped, an edge of desperation cutting through his exhaustion. "The swarm's advanced scouts are already probing our perimeter. Full engagement within hours, not days." Vren felt his stomach tighten. Hours, not days, meant no time for careful coordination, no time for the kind of cautious planning Alliance forces typically relied upon before major engagements. Reyes turned to her crew, and for the first time since Vren had met her, he watched something shift in her posture, a subtle sharpening of focus that transformed her from calm observer into decisive commander. "All ships, prepare for immediate deployment. Ground teams, full readiness in 20 minutes. We're not waiting for a formal handoff." The response was immediate and unified. Every human aboard moved with a coordinated urgency Vren had rarely witnessed even among veteran Alliance units. There was no confusion, no repeated orders, no wasted questions. Equipment was checked, weapons secured, transport shuttles prepared, all within the narrow window Reyes had given them. Vren found himself swept along in the preparation, fitted with a human-issued communication device that would allow him to coordinate directly with Alliance garrison forces during the coming engagement. He tried to focus on procedure, on his role as observer and liaison, but a growing unease settled over him as the shuttle carrying his group descended toward Dinar 6's surface. The moon's terrain was harsh, all jagged gray rock and deep-shadowed craters, offering little natural cover beyond a series of ridgelines the garrison had fortified over the preceding weeks. As the shuttle touched down near the garrison's command post, Vren caught his first glimpse of the battlefield awaiting them, and the sight nearly stole his breath. The Drevoth advance force stretched across the horizon in a slow, deliberate crawl, thousands of small, insectile units moving in eerie, coordinated waves, supported by heavier armored constructs that lumbered behind them like moving fortresses. Vren had studied Drevoth tactics extensively over his years of service, and he recognized the pattern immediately. This was not a probing attack. This was a full assault, arriving far sooner and in far greater numbers than the garrison had prepared for. "That's not what our scouts reported," Commander Doss said grimly, meeting them at the command post, his face etched with exhaustion and barely restrained panic. "We were told half this size, arriving days from now." "The swarm adapts," Vren said quietly. "It has learned to move faster when it senses weakness." Reyes studied the approaching force with narrowed eyes, already tracing patterns across a holographic display projected from her wrist unit. "Commander Doss, what's your current defensive formation?" Doss gestured toward a rough diagram showing 3 defensive lines arranged in traditional alliance fashion, evenly spaced along the ridge, each line prepared to hold as long as possible before falling back to the next. Reyes studied it for only a few seconds before shaking her head. "This won't hold against a force that size. Even distribution spreads your strength too thin, across too wide a front. They'll break through in multiple points simultaneously, and encircle your central position within the hour." "It is standard alliance doctrine," Doss said, a defensive edge entering his tired voice. "It has held against smaller Drevoth incursions before." "Against smaller incursions," Reyes agreed. "Not against this. We need to concentrate strength where it matters, and accept controlled losses elsewhere." Vren watched the exchange with growing tension, understanding the weight of what Reyes was suggesting. Alliance doctrine valued even distribution, minimizing risk across the entire line, rather than accepting deliberate sacrifice in one area to strengthen another. It was a philosophy built from centuries of cautious, attritional warfare, and it clashed directly with whatever instinct now guided Reyes's rapid calculations. "Explain," Doss said finally, though clearly reluctant. Reyes adjusted the holographic display, highlighting a narrow choke point along the eastern ridge, where the terrain naturally funneled approaching forces into a tighter corridor. "Pull your eastern line back to here. Let them think they're breaking through. Concentrate heavier defenses at this choke point instead, along with everything my ground teams can bring. When their main force commits to what looks like an opening, we close it from both sides." "That leaves our western flank dangerously thin," Doss objected. "It does," Reyes acknowledged, "which is why we need every non-essential unit repositioned west immediately, holding a defensive posture only, no offensive engagement. Buy time, don't seek victory there. The real fight happens east." Vren studied the plan being outlined before him, recognizing both its brilliance and its terrible risk. If the western flank failed to hold even a defensive posture, the garrison's entire position could collapse from an unexpected direction. Yet if it worked, it offered something no traditional alliance strategy had achieved in months, a genuine chance to break the Drevoth advance rather than simply delay it. Doss hesitated only a moment longer before nodding sharply. "Do it. Reyes, your forces have tactical authority over the eastern engagement. I'll hold western defense personally." The following hour passed in a blur of urgent repositioning, garrison forces moving with hurried, imperfect coordination as they adjusted to an unfamiliar strategy under impossible time pressure. Vren remained close to Reyes throughout, partly fulfilling his liaison duties and partly unable to look away from the calm, methodical way she directed both human and alliance forces, despite the mounting chaos around them. By the time the Drevoth advance force reached striking distance, the garrison's new formation had barely settled into place. Vren stood near the eastern choke point alongside Reyes, watching the enemy's slow, relentless approach with a tightness in his chest that had little to do with physical danger and everything to do with uncertainty over whether this untested strategy would hold. The first waves of Drevoth units surged forward exactly as Reyes had predicted, probing the weakened western flank before shifting their primary assault toward the apparent opening along the east. Vren watched the enemy formation funnel directly into the choke point, exactly as the terrain and deliberate false weakness had been designed to encourage. "Hold position," Reyes said into her comm, her voice steady despite the mounting pressure. "Let them commit fully before engaging." The waiting stretched unbearably, every instinct in Vren screaming to act sooner, to strike before the enemy drew any closer. But he forced himself to trust the plan, watching as the Drevoth force poured deeper into the narrowing corridor. Thousands of units now committed to a path that offered no easy retreat. "Now," Reyes said quietly. The response was immediate and devastating in its coordination. Human ground teams unleashed concentrated defensive fire from prepared positions along both sides of the choke point, while overhead, human ships executed precise strikes against the heavier Drevoth constructs attempting to reinforce the advance. Simultaneously, garrison forces sealed the corridor's far end, trapping the committed enemy force within a killing ground it could not easily escape. Vren watched the battle unfold with something between awe and disbelief. The coordination between human and alliance forces, despite having trained together for less than a day, moved with a fluidity he had never witnessed in his decades of service. Human units adapted their positioning in real time based on shifting enemy patterns, communicating rapid adjustments across the battlefield with an efficiency that left little room for confusion or hesitation. Yet even as the eastern trap closed successfully around the enemy's main force, alarming reports began filtering in from the western flank. Doss's voice crackled across the comm, tension straining every word. "Western line is buckling. We're taking heavier pressure than anticipated. I need reinforcement." Reyes's expression tightened, the first visible sign of genuine strain Vren had seen from her since their arrival. She studied the battlefield display rapidly, weighing options that all carried significant risk. "Pierce," she said into her comm, "redirect your team west. Immediate support for garrison forces. Everyone else, hold the eastern trap. We cannot let this force escape now that it's committed." Vren recognized the terrible calculation being made in real time, splitting already limited resources between securing a hard-won advantage and preventing a potential collapse elsewhere. It was exactly the kind of impossible decision that had haunted Alliance commanders throughout the war, decisions where every available choice carried devastating consequences. The following 20 minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the eastern trap holding under immense pressure, while western defenses buckled and reformed repeatedly under Ryan Pierce's hastily redirected support. Vren found himself relaying constant updates between human and alliance forces, his liaison role suddenly far more critical than the passive observation he had originally expected. Slowly, painstakingly, the tide began to shift. The eastern trap, though costly, succeeded in eliminating the bulk of the Drevoth main force, breaking the coordinated momentum that had driven its rapid advance. With their primary assault crippled, the remaining Drevoth units besieging the western flank lost cohesion, their attack pattern becoming erratic and disorganized without central coordination. By the time the immediate threat subsided, dawn had broken fully over Dinar 6's pale gray terrain, illuminating a battlefield scarred but ultimately held. Vren stood near the command post afterward, exhaustion settling heavily over him as he processed the events of the preceding hours. Commander Doss approached, looking equally drained but carrying an expression Vren rarely witnessed among Alliance officers after such an engagement, something resembling genuine, cautious hope. "We held," Doss said, almost disbelieving. "We actually held." "Not without cost," Reyes said quietly, glancing toward the casualty reports beginning to compile across her display. Her expression carried none of the triumph Vren expected, only a weighted, sober acknowledgement of the losses required to secure the outcome. Vren studied her carefully, beginning to understand something fundamental about the species he had spent the preceding day observing. Humans did not fight recklessly, nor did they treat conflict as something to be relished. They fought with careful, calculated precision, accepting necessary sacrifice only when the alternative guaranteed far greater loss. It was neither the cautious hesitation of Alliance doctrine, nor the reckless aggression Vren had half expected from an unfamiliar species. It was something else entirely. A hardened, practical resolve, forged from a history Vren was only beginning to understand. As emergency medical teams moved across the battlefield, tending to wounded from both human and Alliance forces alike, Vren found himself standing beside Reyes, watching the sun rise fully over a moon that had, against significant odds, avoided the fate of 40 worlds before it.
"This won't be the last engagement like this," Vren said quietly. "No," Reyes agreed, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It won't." "Are your forces prepared for what comes next?" Reyes turned toward him, something unreadable behind her tired eyes.
"We didn't come here expecting an easy fight, Vren. We came because we understood exactly what we were walking into." Vren considered her words carefully, aware that his understanding of humanity had shifted dramatically over the course of a single, brutal engagement. Yet he also sensed, with growing certainty, that he had only begun to glimpse the true depth of what this small, unfamiliar species was truly capable of. Behind them, the Alliance garrison began the slow process of rebuilding, while overhead, human ships resumed careful, methodical patrols across Dinar 6's recovering skies. And somewhere beyond the horizon, Vren knew, the Drevoth swarm was already recalculating, already adapting to a new and unexpected variable it had never before encountered. The war was far from over. But for the first time in longer than Vren could remember, it no longer felt entirely one-sided. 3 weeks after the battle at Dinar 6, Vren found himself aboard a human vessel again, though the circumstances this time felt entirely different. He had been formally requested, not merely assigned, to continue his liaison work with the Earth Coalition fleet, and the request had come with an unusual addition: full access to human command channels and historical archives, an offer meant to improve coordination between species, but one that Vren suspected carried deeper implications. He accepted immediately. The ship, a mid-sized vessel called the Meridian, served as a mobile command center for the small but growing human presence within Alliance space. As more human units arrived to reinforce other struggling fronts across the war, the Meridian had become something of a hub, coordinating deployments and sharing intelligence between scattered human detachments and their Alliance counterparts. Vren spent his first days aboard simply observing, cataloging the rhythms of daily life among a species he was determined to understand more fully. What struck him most was the strange duality he noticed almost immediately. During active operations, humans displayed a level of focus and controlled intensity that rivaled anything he had witnessed among Alliance forces. Yet the moment operations concluded, that same intensity dissolved almost entirely, replaced by an easy, almost playful camaraderie that Vren found difficult to reconcile with what he had witnessed on the battlefield. He mentioned this observation to Reyes during a quiet moment in the ship's galley, where she sat reviewing reports while eating a simple meal, alongside several off-duty crew members. "You fight like you expect to die," Vren said carefully, "and then you laugh together like nothing happened at all." Reyes considered the observation for a long moment before responding. "It's not that nothing happened. It's that dwelling on it constantly doesn't make us better at the next fight. It just wears us down faster." Alliance forces struggle with this, Vren admitted. Many carry the weight of engagements long after they conclude. It affects performance, morale, decision-making. "We used to struggle with it too," Reyes said. "Still do, honestly. Some of us more than others. But we've had a lot longer to figure out how to function despite it. Longer than most species get, unfortunately." Vren wanted to understand this history she referenced so casually, and later that evening, granted access to the archives he had been promised, he began reading. What he discovered over the following days reshaped nearly everything he thought he understood about the species he had been assigned to observe. Human history, spanning barely a few thousand recorded years, compared to the tens of thousands documented by older Alliance species, contained an almost unbroken chain of internal conflict. Nations had fought nations. Ideologies had clashed with ideologies. Entire generations had grown up knowing little beyond periods of struggle followed by uneasy peace, followed inevitably by renewed conflict elsewhere. Vren had assumed, based on early Alliance reports, that this made humanity simply violent, undisciplined, dangerous by nature. The archives told a far more complicated story. Alongside every recorded conflict, Vren found equally extensive records of recovery, of societies rebuilding from devastation, of former adversaries eventually cooperating, even forming lasting partnerships. Human history was not merely a chronicle of violence, but a chronicle of adaptation, a species that had repeatedly been forced to develop new methods of organizing, communicating, and surviving conflict, only to then develop equally sophisticated methods of moving beyond it. He found this pattern reflected clearly in humanity's approach to the current war. Unlike many Alliance species, who had lived in relative internal peace for centuries before encountering the Dravoth swarm, humans arrived at this conflict, already carrying deeply ingrained instincts for organized resistance, rapid adaptation, and collective coordination under extreme pressure. It was not that humans enjoyed conflict, Vren began to realize. It was that they had simply never been permitted the luxury of avoiding it entirely, and so had become remarkably practiced at surviving it. He raised this observation during a private conversation with Ryan Pierce several days later, finding the soldier maintaining equipment in one of the Meridian's lower storage bays. "Your history troubles me," Vren admitted. "Not because it suggests danger, but because it suggests a species shaped almost entirely by necessity rather than choice." Pierce paused his work, considering the observation seriously. "That's probably fair. Most of what we're good at, we didn't choose to be good at. We just didn't have another option most of the time. Does that trouble your people?" "Sometimes," Pierce admitted. "There's a lot of history we're not proud of. A lot of mistakes we keep having to relearn from. But I think most of us would rather carry that weight and keep improving than pretend it never happened." Vren found himself increasingly drawn to these quiet conversations, gathering fragments of understanding that no official report could adequately capture. He spoke with Grace Hale, a young engineer responsible for much of the Meridian's rapid technical improvements, who explained humanity's tendency toward constant innovation, not as ambition, but as habit, born from centuries of needing to solve problems faster than their circumstances allowed. He spoke with Noah Webb, a quiet, reserved tactical officer, who described human strategy not as inherently aggressive, but as fundamentally results-oriented, willing to abandon traditional approaches the moment evidence suggested a better alternative existed, regardless of how unconventional that alternative might appear. Slowly, Vren began compiling a picture of humanity that diverged sharply from both his initial assumptions and the outdated Alliance reports he had once relied upon. These were not reckless creatures driven by chaos, nor were they calculated strategists, devoid of genuine feeling. They were something more complicated, a species whose entire history had forced them to develop an unusual balance between fierce, focused capability during crisis and genuine, restorative connection once that crisis passed. Yet as Vren's understanding deepened, so too did a growing unease spreading among certain factions within the broader Alliance Council. Word of humanity's effectiveness at Dinar 6 had spread quickly, and not all of it was received with unqualified enthusiasm. Vren found himself summoned to a private briefing aboard a nearby Alliance vessel, where several senior officers, including Commander Solari, waited with expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to open suspicion. "Your reports have been thorough," Solari said, once formalities concluded. "Perhaps too thorough. The Council is divided on how to interpret them." "Divided how?" Vren asked, though he suspected he already understood. A senior officer Vren did not recognize, an older Caliph named Tessic, spoke next, his tone carrying barely concealed wariness. "Your reports describe a species capable of extraordinary tactical adaptation, willing to accept significant losses in pursuit of decisive outcomes, and possessing technological capabilities advancing at a rate our own analysts struggle to track accurately. Some among the Council question whether we have simply exchanged one uncertain variable for another. You question whether humanity poses a threat to the Alliance itself," Vren said plainly, unwilling to dance around the implication. "We question," Tessic said carefully, "whether a species capable of such rapid adaptation under pressure might prove equally capable of turning that same adaptation against allies, should circumstances shift." Vren considered the accusation seriously, understanding the underlying fear even as he found himself increasingly certain it was misplaced. "I have spent considerable time among human forces these past weeks," he said. "I have reviewed their history, observed their conduct both during and after conflict, and coordinated directly with their command structure. Nothing I have witnessed suggests intent toward anything beyond the stated goal of ending the Dravoth threat. Intent can change, Tessic said. Intent can change for any species, Vren countered, including our own. The question is not whether humanity could theoretically become a threat under different circumstances. The question is whether their assistance now, against an enemy actively destroying inhabited systems, outweighs speculative concerns about a future that has not yet occurred. Solari studied Vren carefully, though whether with approval or renewed caution, Vren could not immediately determine. Your assessment carries weight, Vren, but understand that not everyone on the Council shares your confidence. Continue your observations. The Alliance needs clarity, not assumptions, before committing further resources toward deeper cooperation. Vren returned to the Meridian, troubled by the briefing, uncertain how much of the Council's wariness stemmed from legitimate caution versus simple discomfort with an unfamiliar, rapidly adapting variable, entering a war that had, until recently, followed painfully predictable patterns. He shared his concerns with Reyes later that evening, finding her reviewing deployment reports in the ship's modest command room. The Council is worried about us, he said plainly. Reyes did not appear surprised. We expected that, eventually. Fast change makes people nervous, especially people who've spent centuries relying on slow, careful process. Does it concern you, being viewed with suspicion by those you came to help? Reyes set aside her reports, considering the question with the same careful thoughtfulness Vren had come to expect from her. A little, but I understand where it comes from. We showed up quickly, changed a lot of assumptions in a very short time, and we're still mostly unknown to your people. Suspicion is a reasonable response to the unknown, especially during a war this costly. How do you address it? The same way we address everything else, Reyes said, by continuing to do what we came here to do, and letting the results speak clearly enough that suspicion eventually gives way to understanding. We're not interested in convincing anyone through words alone. Actions are what matter here. Vren found himself nodding slowly, recognizing in her response the same practical, results-driven philosophy he had observed throughout every aspect of humanity's conduct within the war. Yet even as he accepted her reasoning, he understood the coming weeks would likely test that philosophy far more severely than either of them currently anticipated. Reports began arriving over the following days, indicating a significant shift in Dravoth swarm behavior across multiple fronts. Having suffered a rare decisive defeat at Dinar 6, the swarm appeared to be adapting its strategies in response, consolidating scattered forces into fewer, significantly larger offensive groups, seemingly determined to overwhelm any future resistance through sheer concentrated numbers, rather than the broad, distributed advances it had favored previously. Vren studied the incoming intelligence alongside Reyes and her senior officers, watching as the true scale of this strategic shift became increasingly clear. One particular formation, designated Swarm Group 31 by Alliance tracking systems, had grown to a size rivaling anything recorded during the war's previous 3 centuries, now advancing steadily toward a heavily fortified but critically important junction system known as Aldrich Reach. If Aldrich Reach falls, Noah Webb explained during a tense strategy session, the Dravoth gained direct access to nearly a dozen additional inhabited systems along the secondary corridor. It would represent the single largest strategic loss of the entire war. And Swarm Group 31 is significantly larger than anything faced at Dinar 6, Vren added grimly, studying the projected numbers with rising concern. Reyes remained silent for a long moment, studying the tactical display with an intensity Vren had come to recognize as the calm before decisive action. Then we can't afford another partial victory, she said finally. This needs to be a definitive one. The Alliance Council has not yet authorized full human deployment to Aldrich Reach, Vren reminded her carefully, aware of the political tensions still simmering following his recent briefing. Then we need to convince them quickly, Reyes said, because Aldrich Reach doesn't have the luxury of waiting for lengthy council deliberation. Vren found himself drawn once again into the delicate space between military necessity and political caution, tasked with presenting the growing threat to a council still uncertain whether humanity's involvement represented salvation or unnecessary risk. He requested an emergency session, presenting the full scope of Swarm Group 31's advance alongside human tactical assessments, emphasizing the narrow window remaining before Aldrich Reach faced overwhelming assault. The council debate that followed stretched longer and grew more contentious than Vren had anticipated, factions arguing fiercely between immediate authorization and continued caution, even as the tactical situation deteriorated with each passing hour. Ultimately, faced with mounting evidence and diminishing alternatives, the council granted conditional authorization, permitting human forces to reinforce Aldrich Reach under direct alliance oversight, with Vren once again assigned as primary liaison. As preparations began for what promised to be the largest engagement humanity had yet undertaken within Alliance space, Vren found himself reflecting on everything he had learned over the preceding weeks. He thought of humanity's complicated history, their unusual balance between focused intensity and genuine connection, their practical, results-driven philosophy, forged from centuries of necessity rather than choice. He thought, too, of the growing suspicion still lingering among certain Alliance factions, suspicion that recent events at Dinar 6 had only partially addressed. Aldrich Reach, Vren understood, would prove far more than a critical military engagement. It would serve as the clearest test yet of whether humanity's presence within this war represented the salvation the Alliance desperately needed, or the beginning of complications no one had yet fully anticipated. As the Meridian prepared for departure alongside a rapidly assembling joint fleet, Vren found Reyes standing near the observation deck, watching final preparations unfold with quiet, focused determination. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. Reyes turned toward him, something steady and resolute settling behind her tired eyes. "We don't really get the luxury of not being ready, Vren. Aldrich Reach doesn't wait for confidence. It just happens, whether we feel prepared or not." Vren nodded slowly, understanding the truth in her words far more deeply than he had weeks earlier, before witnessing firsthand the strange, complicated resilience of the species he had been assigned to observe. Whatever awaited them at Aldrich Reach, he suspected it would reveal far more about humanity, and about the true nature of the fear beginning to spread quietly across the Alliance Council, than any report he had filed so far. The fleet moved out beneath a darkening field of distant stars, carrying with it the uneasy hope of an alliance still learning to trust an ally it barely understood. Aldrich Reach appeared on the Meridian's main display 3 days later, a sprawling junction system anchored by a heavily fortified space station and surrounded by a scattering of smaller defensive outposts. Vren had visited junction systems before, but none carried the same weight of significance as this one, a critical crossing point standing between the Drevoth swarm and nearly a dozen inhabited worlds that had, until now, remained largely untouched by the war's devastation. The joint fleet arrived to find Aldrich Reach's defenses already stretched thin, Alliance forces working urgently alongside newly arrived human ships to establish coordinated defensive positions before Swarm Group 31's advance reached striking distance. Vren stood on the Meridian's bridge alongside Reyes, watching sensor readings update with grim regularity as the enemy formation drew steadily closer. "Numbers are worse than initial estimates," Noah Webb reported, studying the latest scans with visible concern. "Swarm Group 31 has absorbed at least 2 smaller formations along its route. We're looking at nearly triple the force encountered at Dinar 6. Vren felt a familiar tightness settle in his chest, the same uneasy anticipation he had experienced before the battle for Dinar 6, though magnified now by the sheer scale of what approached. "The traditional choke point strategy that succeeded before will not work against a force this large," he said. "There simply isn't a corridor narrow enough to fully contain numbers of this magnitude." "Agreed," Reyes said, already studying alternative approaches across her tactical display. "We need something different this time, something they haven't adapted to yet." Over the following hours, Vren watched as human and Alliance strategists worked together with an intensity he had not witnessed even during the preparations for Dinar 6. Commander Solari, who had arrived personally to oversee Alliance forces at this critical engagement, joined the planning sessions alongside Reyes, the 2 officers gradually developing a mutual respect, forged through shared urgency, rather than lingering suspicion. "Your forces demonstrated something valuable at Dinar 6, Solari admitted during one particularly tense session. "A willingness to adapt strategy mid-engagement that Alliance doctrine has traditionally discouraged. Perhaps that same willingness offers our best path forward here. Reyes nodded, studying the defensive layout surrounding Aldrich Reach's central station. Traditional defense assumes we can predict enemy movement accurately enough to prepare fixed positions. Against a force this size, that assumption breaks down quickly. We need a strategy built around continuous adaptation, rather than fixed preparation. Explain, Solari said. Reyes outlined a plan unlike anything Vren had encountered throughout his decades of Alliance service. A fluid, multi-layered defense, combining rapid response human units with more traditional Alliance formations, designed specifically to shift and reposition continuously, based on real-time battlefield analysis, rather than predetermined positioning. It required unprecedented coordination between species, constant communication, and a willingness to abandon standard hierarchical command structures in favor of distributed, adaptive decision-making across multiple simultaneous engagement points. This asks a great deal of both our forces, Solari said carefully, studying the proposal with obvious reservation. Alliance command structure is not accustomed to this level of distributed authority during active engagement. I understand the concern, Reyes said, but rigid command structures work best against predictable enemies. The swarm has already demonstrated it adapts quickly following unexpected defeats. We need a strategy flexible enough to adapt faster than they can. Vren watched Solari weigh the proposal carefully, recognizing the significant departure it represented from everything Alliance forces had relied upon throughout centuries of warfare. Yet he also recognized, with growing certainty, that conventional approaches had already proven insufficient against a threat of this magnitude. Very well, Solari said finally. We adapt. The following day passed in a blur of intense preparation, human and Alliance forces working to establish the unusual, flexible defensive network Reyes had proposed. Vren found himself moving constantly between command posts, coordinating communication protocols and helping bridge remaining gaps in understanding between species still learning to trust each other's judgment under extreme pressure. By the time Swarm Group 31 reached visual range, Aldrich Reach's defenses had transformed into something Vren had never witnessed before, a shifting, responsive network of joint human and Alliance forces prepared to adapt continuously rather than hold fixed positions. The enemy formation, when it finally arrived, exceeded even the grim projections Vren had reviewed earlier. Thousands upon thousands of Drevoth units stretched across the system's outer perimeter, supported by armored constructs larger than anything encountered at Dinar 6, moving with the same eerie, coordinated precision that had allowed the swarm to devastate 40 inhabited systems over the preceding centuries. All units, hold initial positions, Reyes said into the joint command channel, her voice carrying calm authority, despite the overwhelming scale of the approaching threat. Let them commit to their opening movement before we begin adapting. Vren watched from the Meridian's bridge as the battle began, the initial waves of Drevoth forces probing Aldrich Reach's outer defenses with the same methodical patience that had characterized their tactics throughout the war. Yet this time, rather than meeting fixed, predictable resistance, the enemy encountered a defense that shifted and repositioned continuously, human and Alliance units communicating rapid adjustments across the battlefield in response to each new pattern the swarm attempted. Eastern Sector shifting focus, Grace Hale reported from her tactical station. Recommend redistributing secondary defense line to compensate. Confirmed, Reyes replied. All units, adjust formation according to updated parameters. Vren watched in genuine astonishment as the joint defense responded almost instantaneously, human and Alliance forces alike, repositioning with a fluidity that seemed to confuse the Drevoth swarm's otherwise relentless advance. Where previous engagements had seen the swarm gradually overwhelm fixed defensive lines through sheer persistent pressure, this shifting network denied it any consistent point of attack to exploit. Yet even as the joint strategy proved effective, the sheer scale of Swarm Group 31 began to take its toll. Reports of damaged and destroyed vessels increased steadily as the engagement stretched into its second hour, both human and Alliance forces absorbing significant losses despite the strategy's overall effectiveness. We're holding, Solari reported grimly from his own command position, but this rate of attrition isn't sustainable indefinitely. We need a decisive action, not just continued adaptation. Reyes studied the evolving battlefield display with intense focus, and Vren recognized in her expression the same calculated determination he had witnessed before her decisive strategy at Dinar 6. Their command structure is centralized around 3 primary coordination nodes, she said finally, highlighting specific points within the enemy formation. If we can disable those simultaneously, their remaining forces lose coordinated direction. Those nodes are heavily defended, Webb warned. Reaching them would require breaking through significant portions of their remaining formation. It would, Reyes agreed, which is exactly why they haven't reinforced those positions as heavily as they should have. They're relying on their overall numbers to protect their command structure indirectly, rather than defending it directly. Vren watched the room absorb this assessment, understanding the significant risk inherent in the proposal, even as its potential value became increasingly clear. Striking directly at the swarm's coordination nodes offered a chance at decisive victory, but it also required committing forces deeply into enemy territory, accepting substantial risk in pursuit of an outcome that remained far from guaranteed. "I'll lead the strike personally," Reyes said, already moving toward preparation stations. "That is significant personal risk," Vren said, unable to stop himself from voicing the concern. Reyes paused, meeting his gaze directly. "It's a risk worth taking if it ends this engagement decisively, rather than dragging it into prolonged attrition that costs far more lives overall." Vren found himself nodding slowly, recognizing once again the practical, results-oriented philosophy that seemed to guide nearly every decision humanity made throughout this war. It was not recklessness, he understood now with growing clarity, but a careful weighing of costs, a willingness to accept significant personal risk when the alternative promised even greater collective loss. The strike force assembled quickly, a combined team of human and Alliance volunteers prepared to breach deep into Swarm Group 31's formation toward its 3 primary coordination nodes. Vren watched from the Meridian's bridge as the small strike force departed, disappearing into the chaotic mass of the ongoing engagement, and found himself holding his breath despite having no direct role in the coming action. The following 20 minutes stretched into what felt like hours, sporadic updates filtering back from the strike force as they fought their way deeper into contested territory. Vren listened to each report with mounting tension, tracking the strike force's progress alongside the continuing, costly engagement unfolding across the rest of Aldrich Reach's defensive network. "First node disabled," came Pierce's voice finally, tension evident despite the positive report. "Moving toward second target. Taking heavier resistance than anticipated." Vren watched the battlefield display shift subtly, as the first coordination node's destruction began affecting nearby Drevoth formations, their previously precise movements growing slightly less synchronized, small gaps beginning to appear within their otherwise relentless advance. "Second node disabled," Pierce reported several tense minutes later. "Reyes is pushing toward the third target directly. Resistance is heavy." Vren felt his concern deepen with each passing update, aware of the mounting danger facing the strike force as they pushed deeper into increasingly desperate Drevoth resistance. The remaining coordination node, sensing the threat to the swarm's overall cohesion, appeared to be drawing significant reinforcement, concentrating defensive efforts specifically around its final, critical position. "Reyes," Vren said into the comm, unable to suppress his rising concern. "Reinforcement is concentrating heavily around your position. Recommend immediate withdrawal and reassessment." A brief pause followed before Reyes' voice returned, strained but resolute. "Negative. We're close. Disabling this node now ends this faster than any withdrawal would. Continuing the strike." Vren watched the tactical display with growing dread as the strike force pushed through mounting resistance toward the final coordination node, their numbers steadily dwindling under the concentrated defensive effort surrounding the critical target. He found himself gripping the console before him, torn between admiration for the strike force's unwavering determination and genuine fear over the mounting cost of their objective. "Third node," Reyes's voice finally reported, strained with exertion and static interference. "Disabled." The effect across the battlefield was immediate and dramatic. Without centralized coordination, Swarm Group 31's remaining forces began fragmenting into smaller, increasingly disorganized clusters, their previously relentless, synchronized advance dissolving into confused, erratic movement that joint human and Alliance forces quickly began exploiting. Vren watched with a mixture of relief and lingering tension as the tide of battle shifted decisively, the once overwhelming Drevoth formation collapsing rapidly without the coordination that had previously made it so devastating. Within another hour, what remained of Swarm Group 31 had either been destroyed or forced into scattered, disorganized retreat, marking the largest single defeat the Drevoth swarm had suffered throughout the entire 3-century war. Yet as the immediate threat subsided, Vren's relief was tempered by growing concern over the fate of the strike force, and particularly over Reyes herself, who had led the dangerous final assault against the most heavily defended target. He waited anxiously as recovery teams moved through the aftermath, searching for any word regarding the strike force's status. "Strike force recovered," came the eventual report, and Vren felt tension drain from his shoulders as details followed. "Casualties sustained, but Captain Reyes is alive. Injured, but stable." Vren made his way immediately toward the medical bay upon the strike force's return to the Meridian, finding Reyes resting on a treatment table, visible injuries wrapped carefully by attending medical personnel, though her expression remained alert despite obvious exhaustion. "You should not have led that strike personally," Vren said, unable to fully mask the residual worry in his voice. Reyes offered a tired but genuine smile. "Probably not. But it worked, didn't it?" "It did," Vren admitted. "At significant cost." "There's always a cost," Reyes said, her expression growing more serious. "The question is whether the outcome justifies it. Aldrich Reach holds now. A dozen inhabited systems remain protected. I'd make that trade again." Vren studied her carefully, recognizing once more the complicated, practical resolve that defined humanity's conduct throughout this war. It was not fearlessness, he understood now, nor recklessness disguised as bravery. It was a clear-eyed acceptance of necessary risk, weighed carefully against the greater cost of inaction, a philosophy forged from a history that had rarely offered humanity the luxury of avoiding difficult choices. As Aldrich Reach's defenders began the long process of rebuilding following the largest single engagement of the war, word of the decisive victory spread rapidly across Alliance space, reaching even the most skeptical members of the Council who had previously questioned humanity's involvement. Vren understood, standing quietly beside Rhea's recovery bed, that this engagement had shifted something fundamental, not just in the war's overall trajectory, but in how the Alliance itself perceived the small, complicated species that had arrived so unexpectedly to fight alongside them. Yet even as relief and cautious optimism spread following the victory at Aldrich Reach, Vren found himself increasingly aware that the true significance of what he had witnessed extended far beyond a single successful engagement. Something fundamental about humanity's nature had been revealed today, something that would likely define the remainder of this war, and perhaps the future of the Alliance itself, in ways not yet fully understood. 6 months passed following the victory at Aldrich Reach, and Vren found himself a changed observer, no longer the cautious, uncertain liaison who had first watched humans step off their transport ship onto Kestrel Station. He had spent those months moving between human and Alliance command structures, witnessing engagement after engagement across multiple fronts, each one adding new layers to his understanding of the species he had once known only through outdated, dismissive reports. The Drevoth swarm, having suffered its 2 most significant defeats of the entire war within a single season, had begun exhibiting behavior Alliance analysts had never previously observed, a hesitancy, a caution that suggested even an enemy as relentless as the swarm understood something fundamental had shifted within the ongoing conflict. Advance patterns slowed, coordinated assaults grew more cautious, more probing, as though the swarm itself was recalculating its approach against an opponent it no longer fully understood. Vren stood now aboard Kestrel Station, the same location where he had first encountered humanity months earlier, having been summoned once again by Commander Solari for what he understood would be a significant briefing regarding the war's overall trajectory. The station felt different to him now, not because of any physical change, but because of how thoroughly his own understanding had transformed since his last visit. Solari greeted him with genuine warmth, a marked shift from the cautious formality that had characterized their earlier interactions. "Your reports over these past months have been invaluable," Solari said, gesturing for Vren to join her at the station's main viewport. The Council has finally reached consensus regarding humanity's continued role within the Alliance war effort. And that consensus is? Vren asked, though he suspected he already understood the answer given recent developments. Full, unrestricted cooperation, Solari said. Humanity is no longer viewed as an uncertain variable, requiring careful oversight. They are recognized now as essential partners in this war, perhaps the most significant strategic development we have encountered in 3 centuries of conflict. Vren felt a quiet satisfaction at this news, though it was tempered by his awareness of how difficult a journey it had been to reach this point, how much doubt and caution had needed to be overcome through repeated demonstration rather than simple explanation. I have been asked to compile a comprehensive assessment, Vren said, summarizing not just humanity's tactical value, but the broader implications of their involvement within this war. And what will that assessment conclude? Solari asked, genuine curiosity coloring her tone. Vren considered the question carefully, drawing upon months of accumulated observation, countless conversations, and first-hand witness to engagements that had reshaped the war's entire trajectory. It will conclude, he said slowly, that humanity's value extends far beyond simple tactical effectiveness, though that effectiveness alone would justify their inclusion within this war. Their true significance lies in something deeper, a fundamental adaptability forged from a history unlike anything our own species have experienced. Explain further, Solari said. Vren gathered his thoughts, aware that this conversation would likely shape how the broader alliance ultimately understood its newest ally. Most alliance species developed within relative internal stability, our conflicts, where they existed, remaining limited in scope compared to the scale of interstellar warfare we now face against the Drevoth swarm. Humanity's history followed a dramatically different path, one defined by nearly constant internal conflict spanning their entire recorded existence. A history that troubled our initial assessment significantly, Solari acknowledged. It troubled my own assessment initially as well, Vren admitted. I assumed, as many did, that such a history suggested inherent instability, a species defined primarily by violence and conflict. What I have witnessed over these past months suggests something far more complicated, and ultimately, far more valuable to our current circumstances. Continue. Humanity's extensive history of internal conflict forced them to develop capabilities that species with more stable histories, including our own, never needed to cultivate to the same degree. Rapid strategic adaptation, comfort with calculated risk, an ability to maintain intense focus during crisis, while still preserving genuine connection and recovery once crisis passes. These are not incidental traits. They are the direct product of a species that has never been permitted the luxury of stagnation. Solari studied him thoughtfully. You are suggesting their difficult history has become, paradoxically, their greatest strength against a threat like the Drevoth swarm. I am suggesting exactly that, Vren confirmed. The swarm has spent 3 centuries adapting successfully against species whose strategic approaches remained relatively consistent, predictable even in their variations. Humanity introduces something the swarm has never previously encountered, an opponent capable of genuinely reinventing its approach mid-conflict, drawing upon instincts developed across thousands of years of internal necessity rather than centuries of relatively stable doctrine. Vren paused, gathering his final thoughts before continuing. This, I believe, is why the broader galaxy, beyond simply our own alliance, has such reason for genuine unease regarding humanity's emergence into interstellar affairs. Not because they are inherently aggressive, or because they seek conflict for its own sake. Quite the opposite, in fact. They fear conflict deeply, understand its cost intimately, precisely because their history has forced them to carry that understanding more thoroughly than almost any other species they might encounter. Yet that same deep understanding, Solari said slowly, following his reasoning, means they approach conflict, when it becomes unavoidable, with a level of calculated resolve that other species, ourselves included, often struggle to match. Precisely, Vren said. Other species fear war because it threatens their continued existence. An existential dread born from relative unfamiliarity with sustained, existential-level conflict. Humanity respects war, understands it intimately, because they have rarely been permitted to escape it entirely throughout their recorded history. That distinction, I believe, explains the growing unease certain species across the galaxy have begun expressing regarding humanity's arrival into broader interstellar affairs. Solari remained quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of Vren's assessment. Then the galaxy's fear is not born from humanity's aggression, she said finally, but from their competence. Their ability to calculate, adapt, and act decisively, even in circumstances that would paralyze other species with uncertainty. That is my assessment, Vren confirmed, and I believe it is an assessment that should bring the Alliance genuine reassurance rather than continued caution. We are not fighting alongside a species drawn toward conflict for its own sake. We are fighting alongside a species that has simply never been given the option of avoiding difficult choices, and has, through that difficult history, developed capabilities perfectly suited to the crisis we now face together. Their conversation was interrupted by an incoming transmission, and Vren recognized Reyes's voice immediately as it filled the command room, requesting Solari's attention regarding updated deployment plans for the war's next major offensive. Vren watched as Solari responded with genuine collaborative ease, a stark contrast to the cautious formality that had once characterized Alliance interactions with human command. Later that day, Vren found himself standing near Kestrel Station's primary docking bay, watching as a new wave of human volunteers arrived, stepping off their transport with the same quiet, focused determination he remembered from Rhea's original arrival months earlier. He recognized none of these particular faces, yet he recognized immediately the same underlying quality that had first captured his attention aboard this very station, a calm readiness to face difficult circumstances without hesitation or complaint. Reyes joined him at the docking bay, having fully recovered from her injuries sustained during the strike at Aldrich Reach, though Vren noted a small scar still visible along her temple, a quiet reminder of the cost that victory had required. "More volunteers," she said, watching the new arrivals with quiet satisfaction. "Word is spreading back home about what's happening out here. More people willing to make this trip every month. Does that surprise you?" Vren asked. Reyes considered the question thoughtfully. "No," she said eventually. "It doesn't. We've always found people willing to step forward when something genuinely matters. That's not unique to us specifically, I think. It's just something we've had a lot of practice recognizing in each other." Vren studied the new arrivals a moment longer before turning his attention back to Reyes. "The Alliance Council has reached full consensus regarding your species' continued involvement," he said. "Unrestricted cooperation. Moving forward." Something genuine flickered across Rhea's expression, quiet relief mixed with continued, sober awareness of the difficult work still ahead. "That's good news," she said, "though I imagine the war itself doesn't care much about Council consensus." "No," Vren agreed, "it does not. But perhaps, with genuine cooperation now firmly established, we stand a stronger chance of finally ending this conflict rather than simply enduring it indefinitely." Reyes turned to him, studying his expression carefully. "You sound different than you did back on this same station, months ago." "I am different," Vren admitted. "I arrived expecting to observe an unfamiliar, potentially dangerous variable entering our war. I have instead witnessed something far more valuable, a genuine ally whose difficult history has, unexpectedly, become one of our greatest advantages against a threat that has haunted this galaxy for centuries." "And the fear other species feel toward us?" Reyes asked. "The reports about growing unease across the wider galaxy regarding humanity's emergence?" Vren considered his answer carefully, drawing upon everything he had witnessed and understood over these past months. "I believe that fear, while understandable given how quickly your species has demonstrated its capabilities, is ultimately misplaced. The galaxy does not need to fear humanity's aggression. It needs, perhaps, to understand humanity's competence, and recognize that competence as a genuine asset rather than a threat." Reyes offered a small, tired smile. "That's a more generous assessment than most give us, especially this early into knowing our species. It is an assessment earned through direct observation," Vren said, "not assumption. I have watched your species fight with calculated precision, accept necessary sacrifice without hesitation, and recover afterward with a resilience I have rarely witnessed among species with far longer, far more stable histories. Whatever unease the wider galaxy currently feels toward humanity, I suspect it will eventually give way to the same understanding I have reached myself. Together they watched as the new wave of human volunteers moved through the station, beginning their own integration into a war that had, until recently, seemed destined to grind on indefinitely, without genuine hope of resolution. Vren found himself experiencing something he had not felt in longer than he could clearly remember throughout his decades of service. A cautious, genuine sense that victory, real and lasting, might finally be within reach. The Drevoth swarm has ruled this war for 3 centuries, Vren said quietly, watching the activity continuing around them. Your species has fundamentally altered that trajectory within a matter of months. We didn't do it alone, Reyes reminded him. Every victory we've achieved has depended on genuine cooperation between our forces and yours. That partnership matters just as much as anything we've brought individually. Vren nodded, recognizing the truth in her observation. Humanity's adaptability and calculated resolve had proven invaluable, certainly, but that value had only fully manifested through genuine collaboration with Alliance forces willing, eventually, to move beyond initial caution and embrace a level of trust that had once seemed impossible. As evening settled over Kestrel Station, marked by the gradual dimming of its artificial lighting cycle, Vren remained near the docking bay, long after Reyes had departed to oversee the newly arrived volunteers' integration into ongoing operations. He thought of everything he had witnessed since that first, uncertain encounter months earlier, of battles fought and won against overwhelming odds, of a species whose difficult history had ultimately proven to be their greatest strength rather than their fundamental weakness. He thought, too, of the report he still needed to complete, the comprehensive assessment the Council had requested regarding humanity's true significance within this ongoing war. He understood now, with clarity he had not possessed months earlier, exactly what that report needed to convey. The galaxy feared humanity, he would write, not because they sought conflict, nor because their capabilities suggested any hidden threat toward those they had come to help. The galaxy feared humanity because they represented something genuinely unprecedented, a species capable of facing existential crisis, not with paralysis or desperate hesitation, but with clear-eyed, calculated resolve, forged from a history that had never permitted them any alternative. They were not the galaxy's greatest threat. They were, Vren had come to understand, quite possibly its greatest hope. As Kestrel Station settled into its evening cycle around him, and somewhere beyond the horizon a war continued that had, for the first time in 3 centuries, begun trending decisively toward eventual resolution, rather than endless attrition, Vren allowed himself, finally, a moment of genuine, cautious optimism. Whatever challenges remained ahead, he understood now that the Alliance no longer faced them alone, and for a war that had once seemed destined to consume every remaining generation, that simple, hard-earned understanding felt, at long last, like something worth genuinely holding on to.